What happened in Elaine, Arkansas has mostly been forgotten and neglected in history. While what happened in Tulsa has had a resurgence in attention in recent years, this story is still mostly unheard of. The year is 1919. World War I had just ended, and thousands of African Americans returned home from war in Europe after serving in segregated companies. Since there was no VA at the time, many returned to their home cities in search of work, mostly in the industrial cities up north like Pittsburgh, Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago. This caused resentment within whites who believed that they would lose their jobs, despite the fact that whites held the more desirable jobs compared to black workers employed at the same job. Americans were also concerned with what was happening overseas. The 1917 Russian Revolution led to the rise of communism. Despite this having nothing to do with black people, many, including President Woodrow Wilson, believed in a grand conspiracy that the Bolsheviks were going to use black people to introduce communism to America. The American Negro returning from abroad would be the greatest medium in conveying Bolshevism to America. That summer would see some of the worst periods of white supremacist violence in the century. Dozens of so-called race riots would occur all over America in the spring, but it's the events of July 27, 1919 in Chicago that would lead to even bigger destruction. Despite there being no segregation laws in Chicago, nearly the entire city was separated among racial lines, including the beaches of Lake Michigan. When a teenager, Eugene Williams, drifted into the white section of a beach on a raft, a white man threw a rock at him, causing him to be knocked out and drowned. The Chicago police, instead of arresting the man who threw the rock, instead chose to arrest a black man. A riot soon broke out. This led to white mobs destroying hundreds of mostly black homes and businesses on the south side of Chicago. The state of Illinois called in a militia of several thousand men to restore order. The riots resulted in 38 deaths, 23 black, 15 white, and over 1,000 black families left homeless. Other accounts reported up to 50 people were killed. Acts of racial lynching spread throughout nearly every major city throughout America, but there would be one small town in rural Arkansas that would be home to one of the most despicable acts in American history. Elaine is located in the Arkansas Delta, an area historically developed for cotton plantations, and its land was worked by enslaved African Americans before the Civil War. In the early 20th century, the county's population was predominantly black because most freemen and their descendants had stayed on the land as illiterate sharecroppers. African Americans outnumbered whites in the area 10 to 1. White landowners controlled the economy, selling cotton on their own schedule, running high-priced plantation stores that farmers could barely afford. The all-white legislature had disenfranchised most blacks by creating barriers to voter registration through a poll tax. The white-dominated legislature enacted Jim Crow laws that established racial segregation and institutionalized efforts to impose white supremacy. The white landowners sold the crop however they saw fit. At the time of settlement, landowners generally never gave a statement to the black sharecroppers of the accounts owed nor details of the money received for cotton and seed. The farmers were disadvantaged as they were illiterate. Sharecroppers could not quit and leave the plantation until their debts were paid, so it was essentially slavery but not in name. This kept nearly every black farmer in massive debt and stuck working in miserable conditions. The farmers had had enough. The farmers began to organize in 1919 to try to negotiate better conditions, including fair accounting and timely payment of money due to them by white landowners. Robert L. Hill founded the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America. He worked with farmers in the area to obtain better payments for their crops from the plantation owners. Whites tried to disrupt such organizing and threatened farmers with lynchings, but the farmers persisted. On September 30th, 1919, the PFHUA organized a meeting at a church. Many who were fearful of the threats of violence were armed with rifles. At 11 p.m., a group of local white men, some of whom may have been local law enforcement, fired shots into the church. The shots were returned, and in the chaos, one white man was killed. Word spread quickly about the death. False rumors arose that the PFHUA were leading an insurrection in the county. Newspaper articles claimed that the whites were in danger of being eradicated, so no surprise, thousands of whites from all over Arkansas and Mississippi went to Elaine. Governor Charles Breaux called in 500 soldiers from Camp Pike to round up and slaughter every black woman and child that was in town. Many were buried in shallow graves along the outskirts of the town. During the massacre, Leroy Johnston, who had just spent 9 months recovering in a hospital from injuries he suffered in the trenches of France, was shot along with his 3 brothers just moments after arriving in Elaine to see his family. Johnston risked his life overseas, only for him to be murdered in his own hometown. All in all, 5 whites died and up to 500 African Americans died. But for those 5 deaths, the few surviving African Americans would have to be held accountable for just defending themselves. The subsequent trial would make things even worse. Not one white person was tried for their crimes, and an all-white jury would convict 12 men of murder and sentence them to death. The jury deliberations lasted just 12 minutes. It's likely, even if the men were found not guilty, that they would have been lynched anyways. Armed militia surrounded the courthouse, and some even brandished weapons inside the courtroom. The defense lawyers did not subpoena witnesses or allow their clients to testify. The 12 men were tried, became known as the Elaine 12, and they were all executed by electric chair. 67 others would be convicted of various crimes, with some being sentenced up to 21 years in prison. To this day, no one was ever punished for the deaths of up to 500 people. 100 years later, a memorial was unveiled in Elaine. A willow tree was planted near the memorial. The tree was mysteriously cut down shortly after. The population of Elaine today is only 509, which is nearly the estimated body count of this horrific atrocity.